Ronald Wilson Reagan was an American politician and actor who served as the 40th President of the United States from 1981 to 1989. A member of the Republican Party, he became an important figure in the American conservative movement, and his presidency is known as the Reagan era. Born and raised in Illinois, Reagan graduated from Eureka College in 1932 and was hired the next year as a sports broadcaster in Iowa. In 1937, he moved to California where he became a well-known film actor. During his acting career, Reagan was elected president of the Screen Actors Guild twice, serving from 1947 to 1952 and from 1959 to 1960. In the 1950s, he became the host for General Electric Theater and also worked as a motivational speaker for General Electric. Subsequently, Reagan's A Time for Choosing speech during the 1964 U.S. presidential election launched his rise as a leading conservative figure. After being elected governor of California in 1966, he raised the state taxes, turned the state budget deficit into a surplus and implemented harsh crackdowns on university protests. Following his loss to Gerald Ford in the 1976 Republican Party presidential primaries, Reagan won the Republican Party's nomination and then a landslide victory over President Jimmy Carter in the 1980 presidential election. In his first term as U.S. President, Reagan began implementing Reaganomics, which involved economic deregulation and cuts in both taxes and government spending during a period of stagflation. On the world stage, he escalated the arms race, transitioned Cold War policy away from the policies of détente with the Soviet Union, and ordered the 1983 invasion of Grenada. Within the same period, Reagan also survived an assassination attempt, fought public sector labor unions, expanded the war on drugs, and was slow to respond to the growing AIDS epidemic. In the 1984 presidential election, he defeated Carter's former vice president, Walter Mondale, in another landslide victory. Foreign affairs dominated Reagan's second term, including the 1986 bombing of Libya, the secret and illegal sale of arms to Iran to fund the Contras, and a more conciliatory approach in talks with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev culminating in the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Reagan left the presidency in 1989 with the American economy having seen a significant reduction of inflation, the unemployment rate having fallen, and the U.S. having entered its then longest peacetime expansion. At the same time, the national debt had nearly tripled since 1981 as a result of his cuts in taxes and increased military spending, despite cuts to domestic discretionary spending. Reagan's policies also contributed to the end of the Cold War and the end of Soviet communism. Alzheimer's disease hindered Reagan post-presidency, and his physical and mental capacities gradually deteriorated, ultimately leading to his death in 2004. Historical rankings of U.S. presidents have typically placed Reagan in the upper tier, and his post-presidential approval ratings by the general public are usually high. After obtaining a Bachelor of Arts degree in economics and sociology from Eureka College in 1932, Reagan took a job in Davenport, Iowa, as a sports broadcaster for 4 football games in the Big Ten Conference. He then worked for Who Radio in Des Moines as a broadcaster for the Chicago Cubs. His specialty was creating play-by-play accounts of games using only basic descriptions that the station received by wire as the games were in progress. Simultaneously, he often expressed his opposition to racism. In 1936, while traveling with the Cubs to their spring training in California, Reagan took a screen test that led to a 7-year contract with Warner Brothers. Reagan arrived at Hollywood in 1937, debuting in Love Is on the Air, 1937. Using a simple and direct approach to acting and following his director's instructions, Reagan made 30 films, mostly B films, before beginning military service in April 1942. He broke out of these types of films by portraying George Gyp in Knute Rockne, All American, 1940, which would be rejuvenated when reporters called Reagan the Gypper while he campaigned for President of the United States. Afterward, Reagan starred in King's Row, 1942, as a leg amputee, asking, "Where's the rest of me?" His performance was considered his best by many critics. Reagan became a star, with Gallup polls placing him in the top 100 stars from 1941 to 1942. World War II interrupted the movie stardom that Reagan would never be able to achieve again as Warner Brothers became uncertain about his ability to generate ticket sales. Reagan, who had a limited acting range, was dissatisfied with the roles he received. As a result, Lew Wasserman renegotiated his contract with his studio, allowing him to also make films with Universal Pictures, Paramount Pictures, and RKO Pictures as a freelancer. With this, Reagan appeared in multiple Western films, something that had been denied to him while working at Warner Brothers. In 1952, he ended his relationship with Warner Brothers, but went on to appear in a total of 53 films, his last being The Killers, 1964. In April 1937, Reagan enlisted in the United States Army Reserve. He was assigned as a private in Des Moines 322nd Cavalry Regiment and reassigned to 2nd Lieutenant in the Officers Reserve Corps. He later became a part of the 323rd Cavalry Regiment in California. As relations between the United States and Japan worsened, Reagan was ordered for active duty while he was filming King's Row. Wasserman and Warner Brothers lawyers successfully sent draft deferments to complete the film in October 1941. However, to avoid accusations of Reagan being a draft dodger, the studio let him go in April 1942. Reagan reported for duty with severe nearsightedness. His first assignment was at Fort Mason as a liaison officer, a role that allowed him to transfer to the United States Army Air Forces, AAF. Reagan became an AAF public relations officer and was subsequently assigned to the 18th AAF base unit in Culver City, where he felt that it was impossible to remove an incompetent or lazy worker due to what he felt was the incompetence, the delays, and inefficiencies of the federal bureaucracy. Despite this, Reagan participated in the Provisional Task Force show unit in Burbank and continued to make theatrical films. He was also ordered to temporary duty in New York City to participate in the 6th War Loan Drive before being reassigned to Fort MacArthur until his discharge on December 9, 1945, as a captain. Throughout his military service, Reagan produced over 400 training films. When Robert Montgomery resigned as president of the Screen Actors Guild, SAG, on March 10, 1947, Reagan was elected to that position in a special election. Reagan's first tenure saw various labor, management disputes, the Hollywood blacklist and the Taft-Hartley Act's implementation. On April 10, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, interviewed Reagan and he provided them with the names of actors whom he believed to be communist sympathizers. During a House Un-American Activities Committee hearing, Reagan testified that some guild members were associated with the Communist Party and that he was well informed about a jurisdictional strike. When asked if he was aware of communist efforts within the Screenwriters Guild, he called information about the efforts hearsay. Reagan resigned as SAG president November 10, 1952, but remained on the board. Walter Pidgeon succeeded him as president. The SAG fought with film producers for the right to receive residual payments, and on November 16, 1959, the board elected Reagan SAG president for the second time. He replaced Howard Keel, who had resigned. During this second stint, Reagan managed to secure payments for actors whose theatrical films had been released between 1948 and 1959 and subsequently televised. The producers were initially required to pay the actors' fees, but they ultimately settled instead for providing pensions and paying residuals for films made after 1959. Reagan resigned from the SAG presidency on June 7, 1960, and also left the board. George Chandler succeeded him as SAG president. In January 1940, Reagan married Jane Wyman, his co-star in the 1938 film Brother Rat. Together, they had two biological daughters, Maureen in 1941 and Christine in 1947, born prematurely and died the following day. They adopted one son, Michael, in 1945. Wyman filed to divorce Reagan in June 1948. She was uninterested in politics, and occasionally recriminated, reconciled, and separated with him. Although Reagan was unprepared, the divorce was finalized in July 1949. Reagan would also remain close to his children. Later that year, Reagan met Nancy Davis after she contacted him in his capacity as the SAG president about her name appearing on a communist blacklist in Hollywood. She had been mistaken for another Nancy Davis. They married in March 1952 and had 2 children, Patty in October 1952, and Ron in May 1958. Reagan has 3 grandchildren. Reagan became the host of MCA Incorporated television production General Electric Theater at Wasserman's recommendation. It featured multiple guest stars and Ronald and Nancy Reagan, continuing to use her stage name Nancy Davis, acted together in 3 episodes. When asked how Reagan was able to recruit such stars to appear on the show during television's infancy, he replied, "Good stories, top direction, production quality." However, the viewership declined in the 1960s and the show was cancelled in 1962. In 1965, Reagan became the host of another MCA production, Death Valley Days. Reagan was inaugurated as the 40th President of the United States on Tuesday, January 20, 1981. Chief Justice Warren E. Burger administered the presidential oath of office. In his inaugural address, Reagan commented on the country's economic malaise, arguing, "In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem." As a final insult to President Carter, Iran waited until Reagan had been sworn in before announcing the release of their American hostages. Ronald Reagan's tenure as the 40th President of the United States began with his first inauguration on January 20, 1981, and ended on January 20, 1989. Reagan, a Republican from California, took office following his landslide victory over Democrat incumbent President Jimmy Carter and independent Congressman John B. Anderson in the 1980 presidential election. 4 years later, in the 1984 presidential election, he defeated former Democratic Vice President Walter Mondale, to win re-election in a larger landslide. Reagan was succeeded by his vice president, George H. W. Bush, who won the 1988 presidential election. Reagan's 1980 landslide election resulted from a dramatic conservative shift to the right in American politics, including a loss of confidence in liberal, New Deal, and Great Society programs and priorities that had dominated the national agenda since the 1930s. Domestically, the Reagan administration enacted a major tax cut, sought to cut non-military spending, and eliminated federal regulations. The administration's economic policies, known as Reaganomics, were inspired by supply-side economics. The combination of tax cuts and an increase in defense spending led to budget deficits, and the federal debt increased significantly during Reagan's tenure. Reagan signed the Tax Reform Act of 1986, simplifying the tax code by reducing rates and removing several tax breaks, and the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, which enacted sweeping changes to U.S. immigration law and granted amnesty to 3 million illegal immigrants. Reagan also appointed more federal judges than any other president, including 4 Supreme Court justices. Reagan's foreign policy stance was resolutely anti-communist. Its plan of action, known as the Reagan Doctrine, sought to roll back the global influence of the Soviet Union in an attempt to end the Cold War. Under his doctrine, the Reagan administration initiated a massive buildup of the United States military, promoted new technologies such as missile defense systems, and, in 1983, undertook an invasion of Grenada, the first major overseas action by U.S. troops since the end of the Vietnam War. The administration also created controversy by granting aid to paramilitary forces seeking to overthrow leftist governments, particularly in war-torn Central America and Afghanistan. Specifically, the Reagan administration engaged in covert arms sales to Iran to fund Contra rebels in Nicaragua that were fighting to overthrow their nation's socialist government. The resulting Iran-Contra affair led to the conviction or resignation of several administration officials. During Reagan's second term, he sought closer relations with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, and the two leaders signed a major arms control agreement known as the INF Treaty. Historians and political scientists generally rank Reagan in the upper tier of American presidents, and consider him to be one of the most important presidents since Franklin D. Roosevelt. Supporters of Reagan's presidency have pointed to his contributions to the economic recovery of the 1980s, the peaceful end of the Cold War, and a broader restoration of American confidence. However, Reagan's presidency has received criticism from some Democrats for rising budget deficits and wealth inequality during and after his presidency. Due to Reagan's popularity with the public and advocacy of American conservatism, some historians have described the period during and after his presidency as the Reagan era. Upon leaving the presidency on January 20, 1989, at the age of 77, Reagan became the oldest president at the end of his tenure, surpassing Dwight D. Eisenhower, who left office on January 20, 1961, at the age of 70. This distinction will eventually pass to incumbent President Joe Biden, who is currently 81 years old. In retirement, Ronald and Nancy Reagan lived at 668 St. Cloud Road in Bel Air, in addition to Rancho del Cielo in Santa Barbara. He received multiple awards and honors in addition to generous payments for speaking engagements. In 1989 he supported repealing the 22nd Amendment's presidential term limits. In 1991, the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library opened. Reagan also addressed the 1992 Republican National Convention to inspire allegiance to the party regulars, and favored a constitutional amendment requiring a balanced budget. Reagan publicly favored the Brady Bill, drawing criticism from gun control opponents. In 1989, in his first public appearance after leaving office and shortly after the Stockton schoolyard shooting at Cleveland Elementary School in Stockton, California, he stated, "I do not believe in taking away the right of the citizen to own guns for sporting, for hunting, and so forth, or for home defense. But I do believe that an AK-47, a machine gun, is not a sporting weapon or needed for the defense of the home." In March 1991, Reagan wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, titled "Why I'm for the Brady Bill." In May 1994, Reagan, Gerald Ford, and Jimmy Carter sent a letter to House members, urging them to support the controversial federal assault weapons ban. His final public speech occurred on February 3, 1994, during a tribute to him in Washington, D.C. His last major public appearance was at the funeral of Richard Nixon on April 27, 1994. In August 1994, Reagan was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, which he announced through a handwritten letter in November. There was speculation over how long he had demonstrated symptoms of mental degeneration, but lay observations that he suffered from Alzheimer's while still in office have been disputed by medical experts. His doctors said that he first began exhibiting overt symptoms of the illness in late 1992 or 1993. Over time, the disease destroyed Reagan's mental capacity. By 1997, he was reported to recognize few people other than his wife, though he continued to walk through parks and on beaches, play golf, and visit his office in nearby Century City. Eventually, his family decided that he would live in quiet semi-isolation with his wife. By the end of 2003, Reagan had lost his ability to speak and was mostly confined to his bed, no longer able to recognize any family members. Reagan died of pneumonia, complicated by Alzheimer's, at his home in Los Angeles, on June 5, 2004. President George W. Bush called Reagan's death a sad hour in the life of America. His public funeral was held in the Washington National Cathedral, where eulogies were given by Margaret Thatcher, Brian Mulroney, George H. W. Bush, and George W. Bush. Other world leaders attended, including Mikhail Gorbachev and Lech Walesa. Reagan was interred at his presidential library. Thank you for watching this video.